Welcome to Crossing Faiths. I'm John Penna, and today we have a very special guest to speak with us about uh, really resilience in immigrant communities in America. Hasia Diener,
Mhm.
it's welcome.
Thank you very much for having me here.
We reached out because we're part of NYU and an academic, and you've written a number of books, and you're part of a group called Academics for Peace. And maybe if you could just give us a little brief of your work at present and really what's the hot spots of what you're working on today.
Okay, so just I am Professor Emerita. That is, I retired a few years ago from NYU, where I was a professor of American Jewish history, and other. I mean, that was sort of my formal title, but I, over the course of my career, studied immigration history more generally, American women's history, food history, and I like to think kind of eclectic. A scholar of American social history. And I've really been, I'd say, blessed with the opportunity to write quite a few books on a whole range of subjects that somehow touch on everything I just said. And right now, actually, it's very interesting, apropos to what we're going to be talking about, as a kind of retirement project. I'm actually working on a memoir. And while I didn't set out to write a food memoir, I would say, I mean, I'm just kind of early into it, but it's probably like every fifth paragraph has something about food. And in a way, it goes in two different directions. Which again, I think is appropriate for what you wanted us to talk about. So on the one hand, it was really about the foods of home. And while it wasn't a particularly happy home, and indeed it was a particularly unhappy home, the one of the few bright spots was the food. And I had a kind of very evil stepmother, kind of almost like in the fairy tales. But the one thing I'd say about her, she was a remarkable East European Jewish cook. I mean,
Wow.
she baked and she cooked, and even now when I eat someone else's, I mean, she's gone a very long time. It's a very long time since I ate in her home, but when I eat, when I bite into somebody else's gefilte fish or latkes, or we just finished the holiday of Purim, someone else's Hamantash, and even made at fancy bakeries. They're never as good as hers.
Really?
Yeah, and I can't, because I am myself not a cook. I can't tell you exactly why they're off, but they're off. And hers were so good. And despite all the kind of, she was a Holocaust survivor and all the kind of unpleasantness that she brought into the home, the food was amazing. And yet, and there's an at yet, there is an at yet, yet to that. You know, I grew up in an American world. I grew up in Milwaukee and I went to public school, and I grew up in the age of television. And, there I saw all the stuff we didn't eat.
Sure.
Like as a really young kid, I remember it was Oreos.
Right. Well, the Midwest, right?
Yeah, it's
So
Midwest, yeah.
I'm
And
a New Yorker, so I think corn dogs and all that other
yeah.
business. I don't lots of
Yeah,
barbecue.
and Oreos, when I say, oh, can we get that? Besides the fact she baked her own cookies, and she would never spend the money on store-bought cookies, Oreos had lard.
Right.
You couldn't
Right.
eat Oreos. And yeah, there were other things that looked so enticing. And we couldn't have them.
Sure.
And I sort of really lusted after them. And they were part of that kind of forbidden American world that
Right.
was sort of beyond our reach. And and then, there was, in addition to that, the sort of discomfort of having to bring home food into the public because the home food was weird by American standards. And
Sure.
so when I started junior high, we had to bring lunch in a paper bag. It's
Yeah.
in the cafeteria. And, all the other kids had, like white bread with, it's almost like a joke, it's almost like a bad, trite joke from a movie, but they would have like white bread, perfect rectangles with pink stuff in the middle.
Yeah.
And I got my sandwich on either homemade challah or rye bread. And when it was challah, the pieces were super irregular. There was one was big,
Sure.
one was small. And she made stuff that nobody else was eating. And so if she made a meat sandwich, like cold chicken, she would lubricate the bread with schmaltz, which was basically rendered chicken fat.
Right.
And so it like seep out of the bread onto the wax paper. And,
Yeah.
and I was like so mortified by like this, like they have such good looking stuff. I mean, it didn't make me want to not be what I was because I was very happy with what I was. But I did think, God, their stuff looked really good. And more than once I threw out my sandwich because I was just too embarrassed by the amount of dripping out
Sure.
of the bread. And kind of in addition, again, it's a sort of weirdly, you know, sort of story of that time and place. But girls had to take home economics. Okay,
Right.
which they don't any longer, and I don't know if that's good or bad. But we had 2 semesters of cooking, and the deal was you had to cook it and you had to eat it.
Uh,
And so most of the stuff was pretty innocuous. It was just like American food that we didn't eat, like macaroni and cheese.
right.
And grilled,
Snickerdoodles. I remember in our
yeah,
class we had to
right,
do
yeah.
these weird
Grilled,
things. Yeah.
yeah, but they were not problems. But
Sure.
one week the teacher announced on a Friday afternoon, she said, next week we're making bacon and eggs.
Oh,
Oh my God. So one of the Jewish girls raises her hand and said, Mrs. Kroll, some of us can't eat bacon. She says,
yeah.
well, why not? And so this girl, really to her credit, said, well, Jews aren't allowed to eat pork products. Okay. And then she goes on and she says, but there is something you can buy at the supermarket. They had these like kosher beef strips.
Okay.
And so she says, there's something you can buy at the market that looks like bacon, and we can eat that. So then the teacher says, okay, how many girls here will not eat the bacon? So you kind of have to out yourself, raise your
Yeah.
hand, right? And, some of the Jewish girls actually ate bacon in their home, so they didn't care. I actually, for a second, thought I could eat the bacon. This was my one chance to taste bacon.
Right.
I knew I'd get in trouble because my parents would find out. So I had
Yeah.
to raise my hand with the non-bacon eaters. And the teacher, again, it's a kind of remarkable, I think, American story, and it's the best of America. The teacher went into her wallet and took out some money and gave it to this girl and said, would you buy some and bring it to school next week? And we'll have separate tables for the girls who can't eat the bacon.
Nice.
And it's
Wow.
so, but it was like just it's kind of like a universe of historical, cultural forces
Yeah. It,
work in this kind of 11-year-old story, the story of
yeah.
your
What an
12-year-old.
interesting, this is what, that one of the reasons why I reached out to you. What an interesting, sort of backdrop. The idea of, this idea of like, pride and shame with when it comes to food, and you were talking about your home life and
Mhm.
and your stepmother. May not have been the best situation, but she was a fantastic cook. That type of thing. So there's both this sort of this sort of a trauma on one side, or
Mhm.
sort of shame on one side, and then on the other side it's this pride. And the same thing with going to lunch. I mean, I experienced myself. My mother would make these really odd lunches, and stuff that's just completely off brand. So my mother's both my families came through Italy, so they have this Italianness to them, but they're really kind of like masquerading as Italian Americans. And so the challenge is that like my mother would make Bedo food. She's a Greek from North Africa, from Egypt, and so she would
Mhm.
make rice, and then she'd put raisins and then some honey, and that was delicious, right? And so I would, or with the chichadas, the garbanzo beans, right? She'd put them
Oh,
in, and so you can imagine how bland that is. But then you can also imagine opening that up at lunch while everybody's got PB&J sandwiches,
right.
and you're trying
Right.
to you're trying to navigate, a conversation and try to just power through lunch, and
Right.
it's not, you would more often than not throw it away, and then have whatever change you have and get ice cream, you know, or something to warm yourself over, you know.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's yeah, I mean, in a way that your story is just, powerful. And it's just, how do you explain, particularly when you put this on kids, right?
Yeah,
How, you don't have the language to explain it.
sure.
And kids have, as I recall, of my own children, one goal, which is to be popular and to get kids to like you and to not be weird. And so there you are, opening up your rice with lentils and raisins, and you're immediately weird. And
Yeah,
my schmaltz sandwich, and I felt weird enough anyhow. I mean, like, what
sure.
kid doesn't? And so, I mean, that really was, so as I said, I'm writing a memoir, and it's amazing how every chapter has kind of a food aura to it. Um, and what have come away from my scholarly work, if this is what you want me to talk about, is that food, does serve as a kind of boundary. It's a boundary within which a community, the familiar rules, okay, and the dish you described would be like anyone else in your community would know what it was. It would be as
Sure.
ordinary as water. Um,
Yeah,
and part of the definition of who you are in that community is, I'm a person who eats this dish and likes it and considers it natural, and considers it what people should eat. But on the other hand, food is also a bridge. And it's a
sure.
way of meeting other people and sampling and tasting, what they prepare. And I think it helps normalize other people, and to understand through their food that they are, yeah, they have their foods too, and they're pretty good. And I
Sure.
remember, again, as a kid, it's in this memoir, going to a yearly folk festival that was in the town and the city, and having a piece of baklava.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it blew me away. No, it's better than my mother's dry almond cookies for sure.
Sure.
I thought,
Sure.
like, why? Who are these people? Who are these? What does it mean to be Greek? Like,
Sure.
I understood there was Greek, Alexander the Great, and the Greek mythology, and we had a little bit of the Greeks in our Hanukkah story because they were the bad guys. Uh,
Sure.
but here I am in Milwaukee in 1960, biting into this piece of baklava, and then I realized there's this huge Greek community here,
Sure.
and wanting to know, who were these people, and where did they come from, and when did they get here, and it was a kind of food as an eye opener to people's who experiences were just completely very different from my own, who spoke languages different than
Sure.
my own, and
Greek festivals really are focused, really on food.
I
That's how they get
totally.
you in there, and then they're raising, it's usually around centered around, a church community or something like that. They have it here, and everybody's going every year for the food, and then buy some, stuff associated with the community. But they use it as a fundraiser. You just like
Yeah.
county fairs. County
Yeah.
fairs, a
Mhm.
big cornerstone is the food, and
Mhm.
it's food engagement, and so and it's difficult because when you have the limitations of being kosher or halal or whatever, there's some areas where you can't delve in the dark arts, but
Right.
in the same respect, it's a cornerstone of a sort of American society and then cultures as a whole. I do babka diplomacy. So what do? I brought babka throughout my 32-year career, everywhere. I brought a babka
Mhm.
with me from Zaros, and plus we're New Yorkers, you and I. So it's
Right.
one
I
of
know
those things
Burroughs.
where, it's easy to bring sort of coffee and cake wherever you go.
Right.
And I now own and run a bakery where we make babka, and we bring it wherever we go. But I think it's the backdrop of food that brings together, the sort of the family community, preserving the community, but also as an engagement tool, is something that's very normal, I think, globally, but here in the United States, where it's so diverse.
Mhm.
And it's in your experience as you've kind of gone through your memoirs and unpacking it seems like there's a sort of a push and pull between, like, your
Mhm.
family and then this engagement on a larger scale. How did when it comes to these things that hold dear to you? I mean, you say that, like, just about every other page or every few pages you're talking about food. Is when it comes to your career, you've been able to talk a lot about
Mhm.
immigrant populations and how they assimilate and preserve themselves. And
Right, great.
food is a cornerstone of that, because it can be used to engage the community and become accepted.
Mhm.
What when it comes to the Jewish community and what's been happening, sort of presently, the Jewish community is in the news all the time.
Right.
Well, how do you see it as food as an engagement tool?
Right,
And
yeah. So for just two things. So first, I did write a book called Hungering for America. I mean, it's not surprising I wrote that book, and
sure,
it looked at three immigrant communities, East European Jews, Italians, and Irish. And in the kind of great century of European migration, the 1870s to the
yeah,
1920s, and it asked how their different engagements with hunger before migration shaped their ability to use food in America to create ethnicity.
huh,
And three very
yeah,
different stories. And, they all pivoted around the fact that food was in America by world standards very cheap.
sure,
In
and
America,
abundant,
even poor people ate meat pretty
yeah,
much all the time. Where in a place like Sicily or Ireland, people ate meat once or twice a year.
sure,
And so so anyhow, but it's not surprising that I wanted to write that book.
yeah,
And because I saw, okay, yeah, food really matters. So in terms of what I see in the Jewish community now, and it's not to me, it's really disturbing, is indeed when there is communal events and for one thing, when there are communal events, what had been East European Jewish food in the kind of core of community celebration food, it's now been all replaced by what they consider to be Israeli food.
ah.
And it's like a kind of somebody described it as the Israelification of American Jewish culture.
What's the difference? Like, I mean,
Oh,
for our
yeah. I
listenership, like
mean,
what can,
no Jew in Eastern Europe ever saw a chickpea,
oh,
right?
okay, I
They
see,
barely
with the
saw
Middle Eastern sort of
vegetables.
spin. I see.
Yeah, I mean, there was no falafel, there was no
Sure.
hummus, no pita. So it used to be they would have blintzes and they would have
Right.
this almond cookie called mandelbread, and they would have gefilte fish and chopped liver, and which I always found kind of abhorrent, and kreplach, like kind of
Fuck yeah.
like wontons and knedlach and all this stuff. And depending on the event, they would have, some constellation of those things, and you'd go to a wedding or a bar mitzvah or whatever. That's what they served, and a
Mm,
community gathering. Since I'd say the 80s, all of that has disappeared. And what's become public Jewish food is falafel. Okay.
right. It's Middle Eastern.
And
Yeah.
well, but they call it Israeli. That
Right. I mean, I'm not,
right.
yeah, I don't want to,
It's falafel, it's
sure.
hummus, it's there are pitas, there is this thing that they call Israeli salad, which we know is not Israeli salad. It's Middle Eastern salad. And I was once in Egypt, and it's like and the same salad, so
Mm,
it's the little super fine diced up tomato and cucumber
yeah.
and so it's like Israel, just as it has as a political issue, overtaken so many other concerns among the major Jewish organizations. So just as Israel has done that, so too these foods, which were not at all part of the repertoire that kind of any of us grew up with,
Yeah.
now have taken center stage. And while I admit there are Jews in the United States who did come from the from North Africa and the Middle East, from places like Morocco and Syria and so on, they were not the bringers of this food onto the Jewish communal table. It
Right.
was from a political perspective, the kind of romance and aura and centrality of Israel as a political agenda item for American Jews.
I mean, so there's like in your community, you're seeing sort of this food diplomacy, but it's from a different perspective. It's politicizing food to overlay over the identity of the
Mhm.
Jewish community domestically here. And
Absolutely.
what an
And
interesting way of I wouldn't even think of that, from a perspective, but it's interesting. So you're saying that that's something that's common and something that's happening, and it's an internal thing. Like I wouldn't know about it.
totally,
You know,
totally. And it's in a way it's educational,
sure,
in that it's teaching not just kids, but sort of the American Jewish masses that their fate and their identity and their being Jewish is tied up with that place in the Middle East.
sure,
Okay,
sure,
right. And it's again, yes, I mean you're right, it's politicized, it's weaponized, and they have to shear it of those foods of their Arab roots.
right. Right. You have to, yeah, well, here's a quick, here, I own a bakery, right? And Temple Manuel is right up the road here. And Jeff, the president, came to me 2 years ago and made this impassioned plea that I make challah. And I go, well, where are the Jewish bakers? And
Right,
he's like, well, there's no good challah in the Hudson Valley.
right.
And there is challah on the Hudson, and she does a really good job, but she's only special order. So I make challah every Friday.
Well, that's pretty amazing. So I would say one thing about that, which is again, it's fascinating, is let's say when I was growing up, there were lots of Jewish bakers,
Right.
on my street, and there were three Jewish bakeries, kosher bakeries. They all made challah, but without knowing the owners of those bakeries, I didn't follow them and their
Sure.
kids. But my guess is that their children have no interest in being bakers, that their children are now you know,
Right. Doctors, or moved
yeah,
on to better.
and so that these generally the families in retail, the same thing with delicatessens and so on, just have there's no longer that's no longer an economic niche for American Jews who've had this spectacular economic and class mobility. Like who wants to sit in a hot bakery, hours and hours, through the night, baking. And so challah is now being made by, artisanal, like,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean,
It,
even here I live, there are, sort of really fancy artisanal bakeries, and they'll make their challah and, charging, I don't know, like $10 a loaf.
right.
And again, the challah is really interesting because in fact, we as East European, we as people of East European background associate challah with the braided loaves, and I assume
Sure.
that's what you make.
Yes.
So that actually is not challah. I mean, that can be challah, but challah is a ritual bread from which in the process of making it, a small piece of dough has to be taken out and thrown into the fire as a kind of ritual reenactment of, the when there was a temple in Jerusalem in the,
Sure.
whatever, before the millennium, and animal sacrifices were made. So,
Right.
so it's a really obscure kind of thing. And
No.
so a bread can have the braids but
Yeah.
not be a challah, but a piece of pita, if you took the piece of dough out of it and threw it in the fire, it would be challah.
I see.
And the fact is, Jews in the Middle East didn't eat braided challah. It was specific to the Ashkenazi Jews.
Yeah.
The German Jews had something like it, but it was, I think, round and not braided, but it had more coils. And the bread that I'm sure yours is fabulous, that you make was what was eaten in Eastern Europe, in Central and Eastern Europe. And so a Jew living in Morocco or in Salonika or in
Yeah.
Yemen would have never seen that.
Yeah. They wouldn't be walking around with loaves of
Yeah,
bread. It's yeah.
they basically would have had pita like,
Right. Unleavened something.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's so interesting that that has so I don't want to imply that all the kind of traditional or conventional East European foods have died, but I'm just saying that at communal events, those quote Israeli foods, which are really Arab foods, have moved to center stage as part of a yes, an internal diplomatic process.
Hmm.
Okay,
Yeah,
internal educational process to confirm to Jews that your fate here in America, okay, at this wedding or at this bar mitzvah or whatever, is tied up with Israel, and therefore you have to support it.
that's interesting. I mean, like, and it's because you have a couple things happening here, right? You have a community that's evolving, right, and integrating differently. Like we used to have three Jewish bakeries within a three a 5 block radius here, and now there's none. And you and I both share. The Rear Center is a multicultural
Uh-huh.
center here, which was the old Jewish bakery, which still
Right.
has its coal steam oven
Uh-huh.
in the building. So and here I am, a Muslim who's national security guy, retired, and I make challah and babka. Those are our two cornerstone sort of
Right.
baked items, and I'm not I don't I'm not Jewish. I have about maybe 10% Jewish blood in me, but I'm not Jewish by faith, and so maybe that's just a natural part of
Mhm.
how communities integrate, is that there's people, they move on to bigger and better things and greener pastures, and
Or different.
children's don't.
Maybe not better, but different.
Right, different. And so that's like a natural part of sort of a simulation integration or whatever. And we all lose things, we all lose little pieces as families evolve. And that's a natural part of, I think, the struggle of immigration, and struggle of communities. And but it's counter to some of the stuff we talked about at the beginning about sort of preserving identity and bringing family together and so forth. And then on top of that, we have sort of this third element, which is, you're saying there's at times food could be used to steer a community in a particular direction, which may or may not be desired.
Mhm.
And that's the internal struggle that you mentioned about the identity of food. I never thought about that. That's why I was saying Middle Eastern. I go, okay. I mean, I've been to Israel, been to but I've never, when I think of going to one of my Jewish friends' houses, and I grew up in a Jewish community, that you wouldn't think, okay, I'm going to get pitas. This is what's going to
No, but
happen.
then you wouldn't have, but maybe now you would,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's an interesting sort of swerve in how the community is interacting with themselves and everyone else.
Right.
And so that commonality, I mean, maybe it's not a bad thing in the sense that it there's a there's Jewish communities, flourishing Jewish communities that are from the Middle East all over, and Iraq and so forth, and so it's some, but the identity of that overlay, or the identity of the community here in America is changing, and so what would your sense be if when it comes to, like, I think it was kind of funny when Jeff made it a passion plea to me, and I go, there's nobody here that makes challah?
Yeah.
You can't do that at the temple. There's no, and there's a kitchen at the temple. I go, well, why don't we get some people over there and do it? And he's like, nah, it's not going to happen. Um,
I mean, that's really, and it's both, it's in a way a fabulous American story that you, a Muslim, can be making bread for
yeah,
making challah for a Jewish congregation. And there are lots of a few still kosher restaurants in New York where all the waiters are Chinese.
right, yeah,
Okay, and like at the Second Avenue Deli, the waiters are all Chinese.
sure,
And I actually have a friend who went to a kosher cafeteria in like Williamsburg, and and then the guy behind the counter it was like a cafeteria, and my friend asked for a piece of kugel, so it was kind of like this sort of puddingy thing made out of noodles, and so my friend said kugel, and the Chinese waiter said kigel, because
right,
he had learned his Yiddish words from the Hungarian Jews who live in Williamsburg.
yeah,
So, I mean, in a way, that's really a
yeah,
phenomenal American story. And so while I personally think it's really sad to see the end of these foods, the fact is they'll be replaced by something else or something new. And that there was a time, let me give you one example. And I don't know if it works, but everybody eats potato latkes for Hanukkah.
sure,
Okay, and so when I've taught this, I've pointed out that before about 1700 or so, nobody ate a potato latke in Europe. Well, nobody in the world ate a potato latke. And they said that can't be. They're really traditional. I said it has to be because there were no potatoes in Europe.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so if they ate fried food for for Hanukkah, they ate something else.
Sure.
And
Sure.
so food, like any other element of culture, changes. And while it may be that what they ate before the potato, maybe those were latkes made out of flour, or maybe they were latkes made out of I don't know, kasha, buckwheat growth.
Yeah.
They were fabulous. And maybe people missed them. But once the potato came in, those went off the menu, as it were, and all the Jews were eating potato latkes.
Yeah.
Food is never static.
Right. It's that dynamic quality is something that happens that, and like even the community here, they now there is challah and there is babka, and it's not kosher certified because that's I tried to figure that out. It was very, very difficult to,
Yeah,
to kind of
totally.
weigh into
No, you don't want
that
that.
world. But we do have three ovens, and two of the ovens are kosher. One, so and because we produce that much babka, and so it is funny, like, here it does kind of come full circle where there's a revamping of, I think, foods, and it depends. Like my attachment to babka, for example, is because I went to school in Russia, and
Okay, yeah, and let me, by the way, also just jump in and
yeah,
say that babka was a cakeish, it's
yeah,
also much richer what you make than what would have been eaten in Poland, but it was what Poles ate. It wasn't just
sure,
Jews who ate babka. Babka is not a Yiddish word. I believe it's a Russian word.
yeah,
And it was so Jews wherever they went, Russia, Poland, Morocco, Salonika, China, India, they picked up the foods of the people around them
sure,
and adapted them, usually making them kosher, having them conform to some of the sort of holiday themes. But the food never stayed the same. And so in some ways you're making the challah and the babka for the synagogue in your town is just a wonderful example of the evolution of a new tradition,
yeah,
a new reality that for the kids who might grow up in that congregation, they think, oh yeah, all challah and babka are made by Muslims.
right, yeah.
They don't know. And that's, it's natural again that food changes with new environments and new technology and new ingredients. And that it's again, I say a really good example of the best of America, that the Jews in that synagogue aren't like, oh my God, it's a Muslim who's making this food, this sacred food for me.
Right. Well, it's an interesting story, and it's a very brief one. When I went to school in Moscow, I was at the Pushkin Institute, and there was this really hard Soviet lady who may or may not have been 100 years old, who was my teacher, and 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 she was so mean. I just, but God only knows what she went through as being, part of the, Soviet Union. Who knows? Maybe she was part of the revolution back in 1917. Who knows? So we can't, we couldn't carbon date her. But it was funny because I was in class and she just picked me out from nowhere, and she said, I need to speak with you, and she said, I'm going to teach you how to make my family recipe for my babka, and I didn't, we were, I'm a student, so you're trying to get through in the grades, and it's a very rigid system. So I lived in the dorms, and there's a sort of a mother that's part of the hall in the dorm, and she came up and spent weeks baking with this lady and me and teaching me how to make this babka. And I finally kind of caught up the thing, and I'm saying, are we, like, what's going on here? And she goes, I don't want this recipe to die, but I don't want anybody in my family to have it.
Mhm.
Professor Lubarov was her name, which is a derivative of the word love, like
Uh-huh.
Yalubluti.
Oh yeah, you have to be
Yeah,
on the blue.
yeah. So and so she taught it to me, and we spent a lot of time sort of kind of just staying in that frame of baking, and I worked with the sort of in the apartment that was on my floor, and then would eventually would go to her house, and she taught me how to do it. And you know, she definitely was going through something, whatever. And she made me promise. She said, "You can make it, you can do it, but don't ever teach it to anybody who has this last name." So years later, I wrote her a letter, and we interacted a little bit, maybe 15 years, maybe 10 years after I had graduated and gotten out of school, maybe a little bit less. And when she was sort of passing away, she was kind of sick, and she still made me commit to her not to teach it to anybody. And she says, "What are you going to do with it?" I said, when I retire, I'll open up a bakery. And she says, "I hope you do," very and sternly. And so after this, here it is, 2025, and I'm making babka, her recipe, her family traditions preserved. She made me commit to teach it to one person and nobody else. But aside from that, it's like her family tradition sort of is preserved, and it's proper Muscovite babka, whatever that means.
Uh-huh.
And so it's here in Kingston, New York. But that's an interesting sort of it's strange, and I'm sort of carrying that water. But something had happened to her with her family, and she felt, I'm not teaching anybody how to make this.
So, you might consider and talk to the rabbi, offer baking classes to the kids at the in the congregation to teach them to make challah. Maybe not the babka, maybe you're not
Sure.
allowed to do that, but wouldn't that be really cool if you went in there and you taught the kids how to make challah? And what an important lesson for them in interfaith cooperation,
Sure.
in
But
destroying the raging Islamophobia in this society.
yeah, it's well, that's the thing, is like we spend quite a bit of time with the temple up here, and then the rear center, they're sort of modifying. They're just, I think, on the tail end of their construction, so they'll have a proper sort of commercial kitchen, and but I'll have to talk to Jeff about that, and Sarah up there, because it's an amazing sort of moment in time where we can engage and under the backdrop of food, and really, in our community, we're pretty tight here. There's a huge multi-faith thing going on, but I think when it comes to the community, there could be much more involvement in food. Cooking is really where it's at. I mean, that's why New Orleans, you can have the French history, you can have the Spanish history, you can have slavery and all this other stuff, and it's still just food is the thing that
Food
binds
is
that
the
entire
thing,
city.
yeah. But I highly encourage you to offer your services to teach the kids to make
Yeah,
challah.
it's a good idea. It's a good idea. Well, I mean, we'll have them into the bakery and spend some time. We do stuff like that, with schools around here, because baking takes into account, physics and math, and earth science, and all these different elements, culture, and
Yeah.
so the social sciences. And so we teach students how to apply
Mhm.
the skill sets with something that can be produced. But I appreciate you taking the time. I
My
wanted to,
pleasure. It was a lot of fun.
yeah, yeah. This is one of
I
those
will I
conversations
will
I
look
really
you
enjoy.
up if I come to Kingston. I've had some talks I've given at the center there, and
Rear, yeah.
if they invite me back, I'll look you up.
No, right on. We're two storefronts down, so we're right there.
Fantastic.
So, but thank you
Fantastic.
for taking the time.
My
I appreciate
pleasure.
it. All right.
Okay.
So long.
Okay, bye.